What's up, everybody? This is Flashwing, and welcome to podcast number 2. Had so much fun with the first podcast that we are back for a second round. And I have to admit that this one did not manifest itself as I had expected, but I'm a firm believer that things in life happen for reasons and materialize at the right times when we need them most. And so today, the overarching theme that I'm going to be talking about is what we have in terms of significance in our lives, being significant, the pursuit of significance, and what ultimately I believe we all possess in terms of power of being significant as a comparison to how we envision our significance. And I know up front that sounds like a lot to digest. But as the saying goes, how do you eat an elephant? You eat it one piece at a time. I was inspired by these thoughts by a book that I just finished. It's actually a very short book written by author James Allen. And the title of the book is As a Man Thinketh. It was written in 1903. And the ideas that are present within this book are still very, very relevant even today. And in fact, in some cases, it's fascinating to see a book that's very dated from the perspective of being well over 100 years old, and how the ideas that are contained within that book are so not only very relevant, but very, very, very needed today. That being said, let's get started with today's podcast. Before I get to As a Man Thinketh, I want to talk about significance in my own life. Yeah, this is turning out to be a lot harder than I thought. So let's reset. I want to talk about the significance of one particular person in my life. It's not somebody that any of you are going to know. It's no one famous. But I'm going to take a brief time out from not normally talking about myself so much as talking about an idea to illustrate what real significance can manifest itself as a comparison to what we think it would be. This person in particular, I want to talk today about Michael Steven Kehle, born December 29th, 1982, died September 18th, 2017. He's not anybody that you would know, but if you happen to be somebody who grew up where I grew up, potentially you know who I'm talking about. But for the sake of argument, Mike was an ordinary guy, just like me, just like you, just like anybody. But he had a profound impact on my life. And he unexpectedly lost his life this past week due to a traffic accident. In addition to his impact in my life, he made a significant impact on the lives of many other people by simply being himself. Tragically, he leaves behind a wife and 2 children who will have to live on through their father's memories and experience him through the eyes of other people. But what made Mike significant, at least in the case of myself, was the immense presence that he had in various time periods of my life. I first met Mike in the 6th grade during my period in middle school when I grew up in Indiana. And we had a lot of very mutual interests. We both had a huge love of video games, which even today, that was kept alive. Although him and I have not gamed together in several months. he was actually one of the reasons why I ended up getting back into consoles. I bought myself a PlayStation 4 several years ago, and him and I used to play a lot of Destiny. That was probably the major game of choice that him and I used to play, and I spent a lot of time playing Destiny with him. And I even it was also incredibly enjoyable to have his son Dexter actually jump in with us. And in fact, he used to joke about how one of the major advantages of having a son that liked video games with something like Destiny is he would let Dexter play on his character, and he would just run around and do all the boring sort of grindy work of, gathering loot and running these, little stupid missions and like all this stuff that after a while, if you've played the game, you just got tired of. But his son was always so excited and loved playing the game so much that he would just give him the controller, and Mike could go do something else, and his son would sit there and just game all day and do all the work for him and the heavy lifting. So, but I actually had a chance he actually had gotten a separate account so Dexter could play with us as well, and he was actually pretty good. So it was definitely a surreal experience to see the sort of the next generation, join in and enjoy something that him and I have enjoyed as kids as well. And especially being somebody who doesn't have kids, that was a pretty surreal experience. I of all the friends that I think I had growing up, he was a centerpiece. If you imagine, he was the term that I've heard is he was a connector. He brought people together, and he was always in the middle of the group. And people would sort of come in and out of his life, but he was always the center force of gravity that brought people in. And he introduced me to a number of people that I knew throughout grade school, and some of them who I still know today, who were very, very important people in my life. And that in and of itself is not even evidence of true impact. My love of cars, my love of motorcycles, all spawned from things that happened when I was in high school. I drove a Lincoln Town Car. Was my very first car. It was the family car, and it was significantly more valuable as a running vehicle than it would have been had my parents decided to, just to get rid of it and get something smaller and more appropriate for a teenager to have. But we ended up, I ended up needing some top end motor work done, and Mike knew how to turn a wrench. And I remember I was like, "Hey, listen, I've got a factory service manual here, and you know how to turn a wrench, so we can both read English. Let's figure this out together." And we spent 3 days pulling off like the intake manifold and redoing gaskets and trying to figure out how to do everything. But I had such a good time with him doing that rebuild work, and that is, I had no idea that working on cars with friends in particular could be so very enjoyable. And that fueled an entire additional movement, an ambition within me to make that a center part of my own life. And I spent many, many years sort of daydreaming about that lifestyle. And in fact, I think what has made me such a Fast and Furious fanboy, and also why I would consider myself to be more of a purist, because the first movie and then Tokyo Drift are probably my most favorite. And the reason why is because the portrayal of cars centered around sort of a family-like atmosphere where everybody shares a mutual love of cars, a mutual love of personalizing them and modifying them. That's a lifestyle that I had a taste of with Mike, and something that I chased for a very, very long time. And I even found it for a period of time. but he, I learned, like, he taught me how to drive stick. Like, he taught me the very, very basics of riding a motorcycle, although thankfully he never allowed me to ride. He rode I can't remember what it was, but he had like an 1100 Buell, that he famously at one point made himself mildly notorious because he decided to go down to the Valparaiso, Indiana police department, which was right on the courthouse square, and leave a giant smoking burnout right in front of the police department. I mean, so he was like many of us. I mean, he was a good kid, but to say that Mike knew how to play it safe is if you thought that he was a safe person, that he never took risks or never did anything ambitious or nuts, you didn't know him very well. We did stupid things, but they weren't so stupid that that we were getting ourselves hurt or thrown in jail. But everything with respect to cars, video games, motorcycles, had a huge impact on my life. And in fact, we lost touch through the last couple years of high school. We just ran with different crowds. And but we did reconnect after I finished my freshman year of college, and there was one particular, it was the summertime between my freshman and my sophomore year, that I hung out at his place almost every day. I would go to work. I was working at like a little fireworks store, just as a summer job, and if I wasn't working and I was awake, I was at his place. We did nothing, we'd sit around and we'd play Gran Turismo on the PlayStation, or we were doing stuff to, we were doing some crazy car work or hanging out or drinking or something, just being together as what felt like a family. And then he and his fiancée, soon-to-be wife at the time, decided that they were going to move out to Phoenix. And being a Indiana kid who, at the time, the farthest I'd ever lived from home was at college for a year, and that was like a 4-hour commute. I had never been west of the Mississippi, ever. And he might as well have told me that he was going to move to the surface of the moon or Mars. It's like, why? Why on earth would you want to move to Phoenix? Like, all I knew about Phoenix, Arizona was whenever I would watch the Weather Channel, Phoenix always had its own special brown color for denoting the summertime temperature, and it was always triple digits, and it was so beyond my own experience so I had this picture in my head of this desert wasteland that was Phoenix, Arizona. And so the plan was that he was gonna, they were gonna pack stuff up, but he worked construction, and his big ambition was that he could work year round, whereas where we lived when he was working in Chicago, that during the wintertime there was no work. So he wanted to move somewhere that he could work year round, and we packed all of his stuff up and said goodbye to the lovable places that he lived that felt like a second home to me. And I, along with another friend of theirs, drove out from Indiana to Phoenix and helped them move into their first apartment. And I was introduced to the west side of the country, and I spent every vacation that I got from college, pretty much from my sophomore year on. So like, I used to split my Christmas vacations, and I used to also do spring break. Everybody does spring break, and everybody's like, "Ooh, Cancun, fuck that, Phoenix." So, and of course, being Indiana too, the weather was always much better out here, especially around the Christmas time. It was unbelievable, and it felt so surreal. I would leave like the winter wasteland of Indiana and Indianapolis, and then I would fly out to Phoenix, and it was like I landed on another planet. I might as well have just boarded the space shuttle and went into outer space. It really felt that different. And but I mean, I was always treated as family. And even after I finished up with school, and I remember, him and I talking, and him asking me like, so what are you doing after school? And of course, I had only real two avenues, which was either work in Indianapolis or work in Chicago. I mean, there was nothing else. And he's like, well, why don't you come out to Phoenix? And he's like, you can live with me and, get on your feet. And then, and Phoenix had a huge car culture, and he had himself, he bought, when the Mitsubishi Evolution Lancer 8 landed in the States, for pretty much like the first time, if I'm not mistaken. All the previous versions never made it here. And, he bought one in 2006. It was an electric blue, Mitsubishi Evo. I don't think I was there when he bought it. I was on vacation, but we went and looked at one at least. But man, super envious of that car, and loved that vehicle. And but he was there for when I bought my RX-8. So I moved out here in December of 2005. I think it was like December 23rd. I think I spent Christmas out here. But I moved out here in 2005, and within a week, I had to go buy a car. And so we went car shopping, and he taught me how to drive stick in his Evo, which was I'm sure that was a real nerve-wracking experience for him. It's like the last thing you want to do is take a car like an Evo and have a friend of yours, grind gears. But I made it work, and he was kind enough to trust me with the situation. So, that being said, I moved out here and I bought my RX-8, and I remember he was driving with us during the test ride, and he looked at the tachometer and he's like, oh, 10,000 RPMs, man. I've never seen that before. And I love the car, and I bought the car, and he helped me do some of the very first modifications to it. And so, I mean, we used to go off-roading when he had a Jeep Cherokee that he put a lift kit on and bigger tires, and we would go out in the desert, and whenever I'd come out, we'd go shooting. We always had small, he always had like a nice little small bonfire going on in the backyard and little fire pits. And it always, all my feelings of home out here, I think, really spawned from all of my experiences being with him and his family. And everything, like every sort of like the planting of the seed of a number of different things in my life always had him there. And something that I would probably never have admitted while he was alive, mostly because it's embarrassing and because it's one of those things that you just don't tell people, is how incredibly jealous and envious I was of him for a very long time. He was an easy person to be jealous of. He was smart. He was good looking. He was charismatic. He always dated the hottest chicks. He had tons of friends, and he was a very popular guy. He always made lots of money. Always had all the toys. Always was very. He always had a commanding presence and a confidence that was contagious. When you were around him, you really felt like you were not that you were something special per se, but you always felt really fortunate to be part of his inner circle. And like I said, he was a connector. So there were always new people that I would meet as a result of being friends with him. But I spent a lot of years, sort of in his shadow. And you got to understand, I don't hold him responsible for that. I never felt like secondary, or he never made me feel like I was his sidekick, or he was never the kind. It was stuff that I did to myself. It was never something that was inflicted upon me, which is why I don't think I would have ever told him how I felt, because it's entirely possible that's the kind of thing that makes people feel very uncomfortable and can change friendships in a major way. But I haven't always felt like that. And really what it came down to was, inevitably, as you get older, your people make decisions and go different ways. And there was a point in my life eventually where that sort of jealousy and enviness kind of faded away as I began to make my own way in the world, and I began to really sort of come into my own skin and develop my own confidence and my own assurance. And I started branching out and meeting new people. Part of it was also because eventually, within the first like 18 months of me moving out to Arizona, he ended up moving back to Chicago. And so I loved it out here. I love the weather, and I love the people, and I love the car culture, and I love the mountains. I love the twisty roads in the mountains. And so I stayed. I wasn't, even though I came out here primarily because he was out here. I love the area so much that I stayed. And the allure of Arizona was significantly stronger. And so since he went back to Chicago, our lives diverged greatly. But, we always kept in touch. And like I said, eventually we kind of got back into doing video games, and made that a pretty regular thing for probably a couple of years. And it was only when I started beginning to really focus heavily on improving other areas of my life that, unfortunately, I just haven't had time to sit down and play my PlayStation. And in Destiny, unfortunately, is a very grindy game where if you don't devote significant amounts of time, you're really not going to have a lot of fun. And playing catch up and stuff like that from the perspective of other players is just not a really entertaining thing. But Mike's there's a whole bunch of life lessons. I was when I was talking with my girlfriend last night, and I was just sort of having a stream of consciousness about things that had happened through the years. And I remember one particular story where I learned a very important gift-giving lesson, but it was one of those things that I didn't quite understand more until I was an adult. And I spent a lot of time with him and his family, his mom, his stepdad. I also knew his biological father and his stepmom. I knew his sister very well, his stepsister. So I spent a lot of time with his family, and I remember as a kid, respect and being cordial and polite was very, very important to me. That was a value that I was raised with. And one of the things that I believed was, you're polite by not taking advantage of people. And in my mind, being a kid, taking advantage of people included, accepting gifts. So, you go out to dinner, or what, it's small things, nothing big, but, we're out at this store, Todd, do you need anything or want anything? No, I'm good. And I think like his family decided, we were out and they had like a little Chrysler minivan that we were driving around in, and his parents decided, I think they were going to go get ice cream or something. And they asked me, Todd, do you want any ice cream or something? And I said, no, I'm good. And they called me out on the fact that, you never accept any of the offers that we give you. And I told them, I said, well, I don't accept your offers because I feel like it would be impolite. And what they told me next was something that stuck with me and said, sometimes it's rude to say no when somebody offers you something. And so I accept it because, of course, I don't want to be rude. The whole idea was to not be rude and to be polite. And so it wasn't until many years later I actually caught myself saying that to somebody where I've had friends who are kind of the same way, where they're just like, no, I don't accept help. I take care of my own shit. And I've caught myself several times telling people, hey, sometimes it's rude to tell people no when they offer you something. And then they'll be like, and then they'll change their tone. They go, okay, I'll allow you to help me. And so I only point that example out because I learned things from his parents too. It was not just a friendship, but I mean, I was sort of a guest with his family. And to say that, I mean, to summarize a lot of this, to say that he had an impact on my life it's really an understatement. I was there for a number of important moments in his life. I was there for his first marriage, which even the wedding anniversary, the wedding and stuff like that was very small. It was two of his friends, and I was, of all the people that he knew, I was present for a lot of really important moments for him in a number of different ways. Probably with the exception of his current marriage and the birth of his son and stuff like that. Just the proximity of me being 2,000 miles away from everything. But I'm very flattered to have participated in a lot of those moments in his life, and I would hope that I had even just a fraction of influence over him that he did over me. And the reason why I tell this story, and I just want to emphasize that I'm probably forgetting significantly. I have forgotten about more good times with Mike than most people, I would say, probably remember with some of their friends. And I just, an endless amount of laughs and parties and pats on the back and attaboys and geez, I mean, I feel like if I really sat down and just let the stream of consciousness just come out, that I could probably fill a book with all those good times. And the reason why I bring this up, and I do appreciate you indulging me in a little, in talking about myself a little bit. And I certainly hope that many of you can relate to my experiences, that you have somebody in your life that has helped guide and direct you in such a powerful way. Is because the quest for significance in the world is something that I think, while not necessarily, I won't stereotype everybody and say that this is a desire that all humans have. There is an underlying desire for purpose in my own life. And I believe that I'm not alone with that, that a number of people out there, yourself probably included, that have, at least at some aspect of your desires, the things that you want for yourself, the feelings that you have with respect to your connection to the world and the people around you, that feeling significant in the sense of having a purpose, leaving your mark, having an impact on the world is something that we all desire. And but I think that we have very stereotypical views of what significance looks like. And very often I think that it's easy for us as individuals to underestimate our significance that we have in the world, because it doesn't always manifest as what we expect. I would say one very common extension of significance, or a way in which people create significance for themselves in the world, is by having children. Leaving that legacy and being able to pass on the lessons that you've learned in your experiences, and to mold and shape a young life into a productive member of society, with their own personality and their own wants and dreams and their own desire for significance in the world. And it's a cycle that is both, societal, cultural, but also biological. And I think that's, I wouldn't be surprised if we could actually examine things from even a biological level and find that significance is, a potential survival mechanism. Who knows? But the point being that having children is probably one of the more common universal experiences that people can relate to with respect to how they feel that they have significance on the world. But significance comes in a lot of other forms that are readily available. People who are famous, people who are wealthy, people who are powerful. I mean, we would all agree that if you happen to had the ability to be president of the United States, that you carry with you a great amount of significance and purpose, both during your time in office, before and after. And but these are all in many cases what I would consider to be the more stereotypical kind of views of significance are all very extraordinary. We can't all be famous. We can't all be powerful. We can't all be extraordinary people, and we can't all necessarily be figures of historical significance either. I mean, there are going to be a very small select group of people who have the privilege to significantly impact the lives of hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, or more people. And, but I think that it is a very easy trap to get into, because there are going to inevitably be moments in everyone's life where you feel incredibly small. And as a result of that, there can often be a lot of internal questions. Who would miss me if I was gone? Would anybody even notice? Do I even matter? What am I doing here? I'm just, we're all here for a short period of time, and then we're gone. And will anybody remember me when I'm not here anymore? And it can be a very, very deep hole to fall into if you allow yourself to slide down too quickly, too fast, too much. And I think that the important step and the purpose of this conversation is to help us all recalibrate how we view being significant, how we view having a purpose, and how we gauge the level of impact that we can have on the world. I'll even give you kind of a YouTube example too, because this is something that I've struggled with. And I want to say up front, I don't have any delusions with respect to my time here on YouTube. And what I mean by that is that I've often caught small conversations when people discuss things like, that there's no such thing as, true benevolence on YouTube, that none of us are here on this platform doing the things that we do because we are trying to, execute some form of charity or anything like that. And the only reason I do this is just as a qualifier, because I just simply want you to understand that I don't have any delusions about the reality of the things that go on around here with respect to this. And it's just a giant disclaimer. And very simply is that I acknowledge the fact that every one of us who are on YouTube engage in some very, very very modest forms of narcissism. And I mean, even though I've been falsely accused of being a narcissist, I would simply let the fact that I don't normally talk about myself very much, with exceptions of like today, just stand for that fact. This channel has never been about me per se, although it has taken the form of things that are happening to me as more of a delivery mechanism to talk about bigger things. I am interested in using the talents that have been given to me to help other people. With that being said, the reason why I bring up YouTube as an example is because we sometimes measure our significance on YouTube by the basis of our audience size. And that, our subscriber base is one, if not the most important metric that channels will use to gauge their effectiveness. And you see a number of channels that come and go, simply under the basis that they don't understand why their subscriber base doesn't grow, and they become discouraged and they quit. And even within the last year, this is something that I've struggled with a lot, because I mean, again, like I've put a significant amount of time into this channel. I've got, probably north of, 250 videos on this channel now. And each one of those requires, love and attention, to edit and compose. And, so, I mean, it's a lot of work, and I love talking about the behind the scenes stuff, at least from my own perspective, because I think that it helps other people who have aspirations, or at the very least have their own channels, understand that they're not alone in how they do things. But, we come on YouTube because of with some purpose that centers around ourselves. And I think that in many cases you could argue that our primary motivation for being here is we are seeking out our own forms of significance through this creative medium. Whether you're doing vlogs, podcasts, you're doing prank videos, there is this desire to leave a mark on the world, and, entertaining or informing people is one way to do that. We can't all be the first person to step on the moon, so instead maybe we'll be the first person to do something on a medium like YouTube. And because I can relate to this experience, it's something I wanted to lay on you as yet another way to look at this. And I've struggled a lot, especially over the past 6 months, about what the fuck I'm doing here, and I honestly, I kind of brought myself back to the table because I understand that I play a role of significance in the lives of some of you out there, and it is wholly unfair to you for me to sit here and think to myself that significance doesn't matter simply because a number on my screen doesn't get larger at a pace which I find to be acceptable. And the second half to that is the belief that I was given these talents for a reason. That I was bestowed the talent of the gift of gab to sit here and BS, for what the last podcast was like 2 hours of me just sitting here talking to you. And I was given these talents and these gifts to utilize them in a way to improve the lives of other people. That's what I truly believe. And so I don't do anybody any service by keeping them to myself, simply under the guise that I don't feel like I'm having enough of an impact on the world. And Mike's example has reminded me yet again about how significance and impact is something that is amplified through other people. Because if somehow I happen to have significance in the lives of someone else, then that prompts them to go out and do all sorts of good deeds through their own work and their own ambition. So, which brings me back to the other half of the centerpiece of today's discussion, which is how can I, but also potentially how can you have significance in the lives of other people? And again, it's always seems like I have to like set the stage for a lot of this, but it helps. I think it helps get you into my mind, and so you understand how I'm approaching these things, and ultimately why I feel they're so important. One of the things that I do this with a lot of different things in life, but I really try to understand. I do try to understand other people's perspectives, and I feel like that in and of itself is a very, very important skill to have when you're dealing with other people, because we're very narrowed in our own sensory, I mean, that we can't experience things that other people experience. Even if you are standing next to somebody and you are both in the same moment, you're going to experience that moment differently because you're both different people. We're all self-contained inside of our own heads, inside of our own universes, so to speak. And but I always make a significant effort to understand other people's perspectives and to see things through their eyes as much as I can. And one of the ways in which I try to relate my own experiences to other people, and in fact, that's something that I tend to do socially, is I always catch myself, and I know that like, and for the people who may know me, I wouldn't be surprised if friends of mine would think that I'm always trying to inject myself into a situation. But I spend a lot of time in conversations telling people like, oh yes, I understand this because this happened to me. But I always have a strong desire to relate to people. I always feel like it's more comforting and people feel more understood when someone has relatable experiences. And for whatever reason, I feel that that's always very important with interactions that I have with people. So I spend a lot of time essentially talking about myself, but it's always from the perspective of, I understand how you feel because this happened to me and I feel like our situations are very similar. So being able to relate and to be able to express that I express my empathy is very important to me. That being said, one of the things that I really do try to do in that entire process is I really try to break down complicated situations, complicated viewpoints into more simple, absorbable, and potentially understandable or even relatable pieces. And when I've done this for a number of years from a political perspective as well. And one of the things that I have sort of, intellectually, thought about on my own has been trying to understand where along the lines of people's lives is the divergence point with respect to different political ideologies. Now, I'm a strong believer that experience has a huge impact on people's sort of political beliefs. Maybe not so much when you're younger, because of course we all receive influence from adult figures and we just sort of, accept what they tell us because we believe what they're telling us is true. But as we get older and we become adults and we start actually moving our own way through the world, experience, I think, is what ultimately guides us to the beliefs that we have, and which can be very frustrating because when you're trying to persuade somebody that their particular viewpoint is not accurate, what it really boils down to is they will not necessarily change their mind until they have a different set of experiences that open up their mind to the truth of the things that they believe, or perhaps the falsehood of what they believe. But I always felt like that there was a point in people's lives where there was sort of this equal chance. If you had two branches if you had a fork in the road, I always felt like there was an equal chance that you might go either direction, and that something would nudge you onto one side or the other. And but I always looked at it from the perspective of a political belief or ideology. So, like in this case, it would be say leftism versus conservatism. And I know that there's a whole myriad of different political systems and approaches, but those are the two that I always kind of would look at. And I have to say that I really feel that I used to believe that the divergence point was what your particular viewpoint is on with respect to evil in the world and its existence. And I have always felt like people who tended to be more conservative were more admitting of the evils that existed in the world and the capability for evil in the hearts of human beings. And that leftists tend to believe that evil was this abstract creation potentially made for control, that evil didn't really exist. Although strangely enough, they seem to think that it exists with large corporations and with individuals, but people who are glaring in the face, they're just people when evil is like staring them in the face. Then simply it manifests itself as, these people are misunderstood, and they're just frustrated, and they're angst, and so it's always been that's kind of why I've always believed, because there was such a vast difference in how both sides approached the concept of there being evil in the world and where and how it can manifest itself. But I have to say that has kind of faded as time has gone on. But I've really started to. But there was something that I read in James Allen's "As a Man Thinketh" that helped me see the separation much more clearly. And as I was talking with a friend of mine, she offered some very good advice, which of course is that it's very important that we strive not to label people as much as possible, because people are complex creatures made up of unique experiences, and everybody's different. And labeling people, I think, is an obsession of we have this obsession in categorizing people because we try to simplify everything, and in many cases it helps us, I think, really dehumanize people by simply slapping a very simple label onto them because it's something we can understand, and it's either because we don't have the capacity to understand their experiences, or simply because we're too lazy to understand their experiences, or maybe we're too afraid. I don't know. I guess there could be a myriad of different purposes. I want to read an excerpt from As a Man Thinketh, and then I'm going to discuss it, and this is going to be probably the remainder of the podcast, but it's going to be a bit. And this is dealing from Chapter 5, and Chapter 5 is called The Thought Factor in Achievement. Now, I want to highlight that what this book is about the power of thought to control your circumstances. Now, I've listened and read books. I've been doing a lot of audiobooks, which is why I say I listen. I've listened to books that speak about thought in terms of how it manifests different things in your life, but from a very metaphysical standpoint. I actually started thinking that that's what this was going to be, and it's not. It is a very practical approach about how thought is the seed of everything that we do, and how it never describes thought in a metaphysical light, in the sense of, if I just think good things, then good things happen. It is simply it's like a cause and effect relationship, but that because thought is the very seed of which everything in our life spawns from, the concept is that our thoughts are directly correlated to our circumstances, and that even though we may not necessarily be able to control everything in our lives, we can trace circumstances and things, every aspect of our life can be not translated, but it can be traced back to the nature of our thoughts. The notion that that they control and manifest every aspect of our life. And I highly encourage you to pick up this book. It's still very relevant. It is a very easy read. It's not very long. The audiobook version, which is where I originally was introduced to this, and I'm eventually going to get myself a paperback. The audiobook was like less than an hour long. Very, very easy to get through. In Chapter 5, the title of Chapter 5 is The Thought Factor in Achievement. So he breaks it down into a number of different areas. Like, for instance, one of the chapters was thoughts with respect to your health, and the discussion about how and that one was particularly interesting because, of course, our science and with respect to biology has changed a lot, obviously, in the last 100 years. We know a lot more about the body, but he does directly tie a number of things that we know about your health to how you think. And, we understand that things like stress and anxiety can have significantly detrimental effects to your body over the course of a lifetime of feeling that way. And these were some of the things that were manifested in this book. So while it may not have sort of a direct one-to-one relationship, whereas you can't necessarily apply these aspects directly to your life in a way that will A plus B equals C, it's very valuable. So with that, we're discussing some paragraphs in Chapter 5, the thought factor in achievement. So we're talking specifically about how thoughts manifest achievement. And here it says, a strong man cannot help a weaker unless that weaker is willing to be helped. And even then, the weak man must become strong of himself. He must, by his own efforts, develop the strength which he admires in another. None but himself can alter his condition. It has been usual for men to think and say, many men are slaves because one is an oppressor. Let us hate the oppressor. But there is amongst an increasing few a tendency to reverse this judgment and say, one man is an oppressor because many are slaves. Let us despise the slaves. The truth is that oppressor and slaves are cooperators in ignorance, and while seeming to afflict each other, are in reality afflicting themselves. A perfect knowledge perceives the action of law in the weakness of the oppressed and the misapplied power of the oppressor. A perfect love, seeing the suffering which both states entail, condemns neither. A perfect compassion embraces both oppressor and oppressed. He who has conquered weakness and has pushed away all selfish thoughts belongs neither to the oppressor nor the oppressed. He is free. A man can only rise, conquer, and achieve by lifting up his thoughts. He can only remain weak, abject, and miserably by refusing to lift up his thoughts. And James Allen goes on to discuss how thoughts relate to achievement. Now, these, say, 2 paragraphs to me were incredibly powerful because he discusses other concepts of free-thinking men. And, of course, in this case, when he says men, he means humans. So I've started to understand that the divide that I began to see societal circumstances in a completely different context. It's not that anything has changed. It's the fact that the way that I view them, it's almost like seeing something in color as opposed to black and white. And the reason why this concept is so important to me and the reason why I wanted to bring it to you today is because if you understand what James Allen is trying to talk about here, you have the capacity to be significant in the lives of other people by simply doing 2 things. 1, by simply being a free-thinking man yourself. And number 2, by simply showing people the way. And there was a subsequent piece that I'm going to pull up here for you that emphasizes this as well, which I'll read to you in a minute. I just had to do a little bit of clacking on the keyboard there. It's amateur hour around here, guys, so you just have to bear with me on this. So basically, there are 3 different categories of individuals that exist within our society. And I realized that the battle is not between conservatives and leftists. It's not between capitalists and communists. It's not between libertarians and everybody else, or libertarians and anarchists. The battle really is between people who believe in collectivism and people who believe in individualism. But I'm just going to come right out and say it. If you are on the collectivist side, you are dead wrong. Dead wrong. Dead wrong. So I'm just going to put that spoiler alert right in front. And the reason why, and this is, and what was so cool about this is because I'm constantly evaluating, am I on the right side of these things? Like, do my beliefs match the correct, like, do my beliefs manifest themselves in face of the truth in the world? And I feel like James Allen backs me up 100%. The labels that he applies, of course, are very simplistic, but I will elaborate on them in a way that I think that you'll understand. The collectivist side would consist of the oppressor and the slave. And the individualist side, or the individualism side, would consist of the free thinking man, or the free man in particular. The reason why the free thinking man and the subsequent label of individualist is the supreme truth is because James Allen's own his own argument is that we control everything in our lives as a manifestation of our own thoughts. Like, again, not metaphysically, but certainly intellectually. And so we are the masters of our own universe, and that it's another facet of total personal responsibility, of looking at your life and accepting responsibility for everything. And in this case, he's sort of giving you the delivery mechanism. It's not just good enough to say, well, you are responsible for everything that every circumstance in your life is your fault in one way or another. It's understanding how that's the case, not so much why. Well, or potentially how. Well, either way, I guess it could be interchangeable. But the point is that it's not merely good enough to understand that you're responsible. You need to understand how you came to be responsible. Well, you came to be responsible because it's your thoughts. It's how you think. It's how you perceive. And, it's not quite as simple as to say, think good things and good things happen. But that is a very simple way to explain it. So the collectivist side that consists of oppressor and slave, everything is externally focused. If anything is internally focused, people would be internally focused on their pain. But everything else is focused outside themselves. And I use they just to try and differentiate the two groups. But collectivists their thoughts are only their thoughts do not play an important role in their own life except as a way of manifesting their own pain. So there's not a lot of internalization there's not a lot of introspection. There's not a lot of understanding about, why do I feel this way? If I feel bad, if I have pain, why do I feel pain? But they don't ask that from the perspective, why do I feel pain, as a way of seeking personal responsibility? They ask, why do I feel pain? Because they're looking for an external source. The difference between the two is that slaves inherently believe that they are weak, and weak as individuals. And this manifests itself as people who believe that, that no matter what they do, life will always crush them. It doesn't matter how much power you get, the man will find you. It doesn't matter how much money you get because it'll be taken from you, or any number of different ways, that it's not even worth trying to become wealthy because it's impossible for me to become wealthy because of my gender, because of my race, because of my ethnicity, because of my age, because of where I live, any number of things. It doesn't matter, any possible desire that someone would have in their life to improve themselves, that they believe themselves to be weak as individuals. And the only way that they can become strong is to combine their weakness with other people. And so that's where the collectivist idea, let's say, that's why you'll see them look to forms of government. They'll look to to mobs as a way of convincing other people to change their behavior through fear. It's a collective mentality in that the individual is not important because the individual is weak. Only through groups or collections of people can you become strong. But the thing is that the difference between a slave and again, this is a metaphorical representation. I'm not talking about people who are actually enslaved here, except potentially in their own mind. The difference between a slave and an oppressor is that slaves willfully shackle themselves. Okay, that's the key. And this is something that, and I may have to go through this again so you understand, it's a self-affliction. That where he says that, that essentially, that we want to condemn one or the other. But he says where the truth is that the oppressor and slaves are cooperators. They're cooperators in ignorance. And while seeming to afflict each other, they are in reality afflicting themselves. So slaves and oppressors both have the power to remove themselves from their situation, but choose not to. That's the key here. Is you got to understand, even if it's subconscious, it's a choice. You choose to be a slave. You choose to be an oppressor. These are choices that people make. Even when it seems like no choice is possible, that it's done purely because someone else is inflicting it upon you, or the need is there to manage people, it's a choice. It's always a choice. And so let me back up here. This is why I'm not a professional podcaster, because it's just a stream of consciousness. The slaves shackle themselves. And the difference between a slave and an oppressor is very simply that an oppressor has decided to remove their shackles. But the thought process between the two is the same, that a collectivist mentality is needed in order to gain power and control over one's life. The difference being is that the oppressor believes that slaves have to be guided. They have to be ruled over. They have to be manipulated, because it's their power collectively that the oppressor needs in order to see through their own desires. So as an oppressor, the belief is that they can't have what they want in life unless the power of the slaves is collected together and manifested in some way. It could be votes. It could be, it could be views. It could be tax dollars. Whatever it is, it's that whatever the desires of the oppressor are, they cannot achieve those desires in their own mind without the collective power of the slaves. But here's the key. The key with slaves is slaves need an oppressor because they refuse to accept responsibility for their present circumstances. They don't realize that their own thoughts, that their own self-affliction, their own shackles were put there by themselves. They lock themselves in the prison, and they knowingly give away the keys because they don't want responsibility for even being there or having to make their own escape, because both can be painful. And there's a big, vast, unknown world out there, outside of the prison. And God only knows what could happen. I mean, it could be Candyland, But it could be a total dystopia with apex predators that'll eat you as soon as you step outside the door. So because the world outside the prison is unknown, they would rather stay inside. They'd rather stay inside the prison, inside their locked cell. But the key is they put themselves there. But admitting that personal responsibility is really what makes you a free man, a free thinking man. And the notion of that is it's not even in their toolbox necessarily. In many cases, you got to understand that this is not something that people necessarily do willingly. I think there are a few people who would fall into the slave category who do so willingly. But I'm willing to suspend any type of ill will or negative feelings towards the vast majority of people and say they simply do it out of ignorance. They don't know that they're doing it to themselves. And no one has ever grabbed them and told them that they're doing it to themselves. And, I think that people who identify themselves as slaves are pretty self-explanatory. Most certainly anybody who employs the thoughts and expressions of victimization, because that in and of itself is a slavish desire, that there has to be an oppressor somewhere. And if no oppressor is present, one must exist. Like microaggressions, for crying out loud, is the one that came to mind when I thought about this. Even when no oppressor exists, one must be manifested. Because if a slave was to realize that there was no oppressor, that the doors to all the cells were unlocked and wide open, and there were no prison guards anywhere in the prison, they would have to come to the inevitable conclusion that they remain in the prison because they choose to, not because someone locked them in there. And so that logic is so short-circuiting. The only thing I can equate it to is it's like Keanu Reeves' character Neo in The Matrix having to come to grips with the fact that his entire life was a lie, that it was a dream, that he's nothing more important than something that produces energy for machines that have enslaved him against his will. It's that moment where he was having to come to terms with the fact that everything that he understood about the world was a complete lie. That's the level of short-circuiting that would take place if there were no oppressors present in the life of a slave. Someone must be available to blame. And so that's the thing, is that over time, the real oppressors have been slowly removed in many different aspects, especially with respect to civil rights. The oppressing factors have been slowly dismantled. So now that the only oppressors that really exist are in the minds of individuals, people have a hard time coming to grips with this. So they have to find some other source of oppression and manifest it. They have to find someone, anyone. They're desperate, running through the prison, finding anyone they can to take the keys and lock them in their own cell, just so they don't have to face the fact that they came there willingly. That's the relationship. Now, the other question potentially is who qualifies as an oppressor? And I've given this some thought, and I know this is not nearly an exhaustive list, because I think that there are a number of different figures and circumstances that could function as oppressors. But most certainly politicians, and most certainly the media, and even potentially some individual businesses. Now, that sounds very conspiratorial, and so please allow me to elaborate. What qualifies as an oppressor is somebody who, again, exerts some type of influence over the slaves as a way of convincing the slaves to use their collective power to do something for the oppressor that's part of their desires. Give them their money, give them their votes. But what makes this situation so difficult? Because the question is, like, how do we break people out of that prison? Like, how do we stop this cycle? I don't really think that this is I I don't think that this is like innate behavior. I don't think people are born as slaves. And I don't think they're born as oppressors. They're not necessarily born as free-thinking men either, but I do believe that absolute freedom is the natural state of humans, that we are born with the inherent desire to be free people, free thinking, free acting. But I think what it is that our society has become so heavily constructed upon this notion of this relationship between oppressor and slave that it becomes a learned behavior. It's something that people see and that they emulate. And because it's much more comfortable to be able to blame external factors on someone's own circumstances and not take responsibility, because it's so much easier, and it's a real lazy approach. That's what people end up gravitating towards, because they've never been taught from a young age to accept responsibility. More importantly, they have never been taught the benefits, the true benefits of being a free-thinking person. And again, when I say that being a free-thinking person, I mean being self-aware that your own thoughts are what control your circumstances. And in fact, it was James Allen who said that circumstances do not make the man, they reveal him. And he was discussing the full context of that is the fact that the circumstances that happen to people's lives are a direct correlation to the thoughts that they possess. And that we like to see complexities, or that there are complexities that exist within circumstances, but that you can trace them back. If you were to see the dots connected, you can trace circumstances back to some measure of thoughts, which influenced actions which created circumstances. As much as we like to pretend that shit just happens to us, the fact of the matter is that things happen for us, both positively and negatively. So we can't necessarily, the cycle is hard to break out of in a massive scale, because these whole pillars of our society have been built with the explicit purpose of exploiting slaves and creating oppressors. Like I said, whole businesses have been generated to exploit slaves in their natural state. But I can talk about two of them to give you something to visualize in your head. Number one are politicians. This is probably the most prevalent example of an oppressor. And again, this is a metaphorical sense, although we could argue in many cases that it could be a literal sense too. The relationship between politicians and slaves goes something like this. Politicians create relevance for themselves by convincing slaves that their inadequacies or difficulties in life are because the government has not done something, or has not spent enough money, or has not created a law that will solve the problem. That the notion is that, again, the solution is external. You live in poverty because we have not passed a minimum wage and forced businesses to pay you a livable wage, as an example. So I, as a politician, will use your collective power through your vote and through your money to right the wrongs in your life. And through that, as an oppressor, of course, the politician believes that he's accomplishing something that slaves cannot, because as individuals, they are powerless. As an oppressor, as an individual, you are powerful, but only through the collective power of slaves can you become that way. And they believe themselves to be emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually superior, and that superiority is where they derive their authority. I rule over you. I, as the oppressor, rule over you as the slave because I am better than you are in some facet, or more than one facet. That's how this relationship works. So as a politician, I see or create the appearance of a problem. So you see all these politicians that cater to the slave mentality and do so by convincing people that the circumstances in their life are A, not their fault, and B, can only be fixed through the power of government. And then only through their collective votes to elect that politician and their collective tax money to fund that politician will that politician be able to go to government and right all the wrongs in their life. And you see this happen everywhere in politics. If a free-thinking man was to go into politics, a true individualist, the first thing that he would do is tell everybody, so you guys are all responsible for the shit that's happened to you in life. We cannot fix anything for you. In fact, all we can do is make it worse. The very best thing that we can do is dismantle this system to such a degree that we protect the most basic rights that you have by making sure that someone else can't just come in and do whatever they want, and then just get out of your way as much as possible. And then the rest is up to you. That person won't get elected to office, though, because we have an entire governmental system of oppressors who are interested in accumulating power and wealth for themselves, and they need the collective power of the slaves to do that. So if you create an army of free-thinking men by telling them that it's not that it's their fault, that they live in their own circumstances and they need to fix their own problems, what the fuck do they need you for? They don't. That's the answer. They don't need a politician to fix their problems once they come to the inevitable truth that they caused their own problems to begin with. Or at the very least, it's up to them to fix them. You don't need politicians then. They become worthless commodities. It's like having a typewriter hanging around. I mean, it's nice to look at and it's nostalgic, and maybe once in a while you exercise that nostalgia by pushing a few keys, but in terms of functionality, it's worthless. It becomes an antique, something that you talk about, something that's a conversation piece. Oh, look here, this is the capital of Washington, D.C. You know, this is our Capitol building. Isn't it grand? We used to actually do important work here until people figured out that they need to fix their own fucking problems. Now it just sort of stands as a symbol of the strength of America. You know, something like, I mean, so people are not interested in surrendering their power and their wealth. And so you could elect a free thinking man to Washington, and he'll be trounced instantly, because anybody who threatens that type of a setup is going to be stomped out. Which brings me to the sort of the last point with this relationship, is that oppressors are constantly hunting free-thinking men and attempting to destroy them, because free-thinking men directly threaten the power and authority and wealth of oppressors. Slaves, on the other hand, have a different relationship with free-thinking men. Slaves see free-thinking men and attribute their capability, attribute their ability to think freely as some type of a consequence of something beyond their control. So, as an example, someone would say, Flashwing, you have the ability to read these books and think these thoughts and to be introspective as the product of your race, as the product of your gender, as the product of your white privilege, as a product of simply being born in the United States, that somehow some type of an external circumstance has allowed me to live this life of luxury, or afforded me some type of a circumstance or advantage that other people don't possess. And therefore, that's why I have been allowed to think these thoughts. But that the truth is that my circumstances have nothing to do with my thoughts, and instead only have to do with some external factor, such as, like I mentioned, race, gender, privilege, socioeconomic status, things like that. That it's not me. It's not me. It's not what's in my head. It's something else that has falsely allowed me to conclude that I'm in control of my own life, and it's only by some privilege that I can do that. And that is the relationship between these three different groups. And when you and I don't know and I hope I've made this as clear as possible, because when you view our social and our economic and our political circumstances that exist in the United States today, and indeed potentially in many other parts of, say, the first world in particular, you start to see people fit in these categories. Now, again, I want to repeat what a good friend of mine had told me, which is it's important to try and avoid labeling people as much as possible. But the reason why I feel like it's important to be able to categorize people in this way is because it teaches us how to help them. Number one, the most important thing you can do, the biggest step that you can take today, is to become a free-thinking person yourself. Because that is the only way to have the maximum amount of influence on the people around you. Because we falsely believe, I think, that significance is derived from the influence of a large group of people. And so if we won't or can't influence a large group of people, then we don't even try. And this was the result of a conversation that I had last night, again with my same friend who was discussing this with me. And because I'm thinking about it from like, my God, like, how do we fix this? Like, how do we bring people to the realization that they are slaves and they have enslaved themselves, and that the oppressors have managed to cloak themselves as these do-gooders? And I mean, I mentioned the media being another source of that. The media is only interested in advertising dollars and influence. They don't care about your individual well-being, even though they think they speak truth to power. I mean, they really believe this stuff. I mean, I went to journalism school for a period of time. I went to one of the top journalism schools in the country at that point in time. They really believe this shit, okay? It's only once they get out necessarily in the real world that they become influenced by business, but they truly believe the fundamentals that journalism is about protecting speech, about protecting rights, about holding powerful people and rich people accountable. They really believe this. But the difference is that they become corrupt and they become oppressors who believe that the only way that they can actually do these things, that they can only speak truth to power, is by influencing and manipulating the slaves that they view you as they view as their audience. So they don't care. The last thing that they want you to do as their audience is to be a free-thinking person, because then you don't need them anymore. Because then they become insignificant. You know, these days when we can replace a vast amount of journalists with one guy who just holds a camera and says, well, here's the shit that's going on right now. You know, I don't need anybody to comment on it. I can see it for myself. So the only way that these individuals keep their relevance is by convincing slaves that they're needed and that no one else can solve their problem but them. So again, just a very important point. The way that you bring about significance in the world is not by focusing on how large of a group that you can influence. Because if Mike Kehle has taught me anything, it is how your power and influence can amplify through other people. One person influences two. Two people influence four. Four people influence eight. 8 influences 16. 16 influences 32. 32 influence 64. And on and on and on. Until you have hundreds of thousands of people who can directly trace their circumstances and experiences back to one fucking guy. How mind-blowing is that? That one small ripple, one small flap of the wings becomes a hurricane on the other side of the planet. And that, my friends, is how you generate significance in your life. The problem is you're probably never going to know. So that could potentially be the major question that we all have to face. Would we rather sit around and enslave ourselves and believe that everything that happens to us is not the result of our own thoughts, our own actions, our own ambitions or lack thereof, but instead some external source? And when it comes to enacting significance, that we only take control of our lives and begin to influence people on a significant basis when the crowd reaches a sufficient size to make us actually feel like we matter? Or do we recognize that we all possess incredible power to significantly impact the lives of one other person, but that one other person is able to significantly alter the lives of millions? What's more important? But the key is that you'll never know. You'll never know. You'll never truly know, and you won't have an army of screaming fans who run up to you and want to touch you and hear your voice or receive your blessing, or just have you acknowledge their existence, and they'll never tell you in mass about how you've changed their life and how they've accomplished great things because of you. The trade-off is that you would never know, and that you could potentially die having never known the level of impact that you've had on the lives of other people. The question is what is more important to you? Actually mattering, or having a statue erected in your honor? What's more important? The actual act of being significant, or the appearance of significance? I think that is the question that we all have to ask ourselves. There's a poem, I think, that captures this. That's been falsely attributed to Nelson Mandela, I believe, but it's a poem by Marianne Williamson. I hope I said that right. The source is from something called "Return to Love" by Marianne Williamson, and it's entitled "Our Greatest Fear," where it says, "It is not our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us." I think I just botched that title. But our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is not our light, or it is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, and fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It is not just in some of us. It is in everyone. And as we let our light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our fear, our presence automatically liberates others. This is it. I cannot, from an audio standpoint, underline this any possible more, or embolden it any possibly more than I can with the sound of my own voice. And understand that significance is not what you think it is. It is not what we have been led to believe. Significance is not being a superstar rock star on a stage, singing a song, dancing around, being a circus clown. That is not significance. Significance is becoming the person that you were meant to be. Significance is becoming a person who is self-aware in that their thoughts directly correlate to their actions, which create their circumstances and reveal who they are to the world. And in that revealing, as Marianne Williamson so eloquently points out, it's like we give other people permission around us to be amazing. Like we all collectively sit around and stare at each other, and no one will dare break out of their own shell and manifest themselves as the person that they were always meant to be, the person that they were always capable of becoming, because it would be too awkward to the people around them. I don't want to make my friends uncomfortable, so I'm just going to sit here and be a shitbag, because that's easier and it doesn't freak people out. And I don't bear the responsibility of having to influence anybody as a result. And oh, by the way, I'm not responsible for the shit that happened to me in my life either. The key to understand is this greatness exists inside of everybody. It's not because of anybody's upbringing or because of their skin color or their fucking gender or their fucking sexuality or any other bullshit socioeconomic excuses that people want to make for the reason why they can't be the ultra badass version of themselves that they were meant to be. It's your fault that you are not the person that you were meant to be. But if you can still hear my voice, that means you're still alive. And there's still time, like right now, to change that. And the way that you change that, and the way that you begin to manifest the very light that is inside of you, is by removing your shackles, casting away your oppressors by not giving them any power or control, and realizing the simple, inevitable, easily packageable truth, which is it's all you. Everything around you, every person, every possession, every problem, every success, every joy, it all started with a thought. And you are in control of those thoughts. And you can decide which path you want to take. You can decide who you want to become. Now, becoming a free-thinking person is not a pain-free experience. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. It's going to force you to face both the light and the darkness inside of you, because it exists inside of everybody. But in facing it, you become stronger. But you have to do it yourself. I mean, we can show you an example. But unless you're willing to change yourself, no one can do it for you. They can just simply show you the way. But you have to walk the path. You have to do the work. You have to have the discipline. You have to have the willingness to be significant, knowing that you may never really know whether or not it made a difference, but know for certain that it does, if that makes any sense to you. Even though a person that was very important to me is gone. And even though it's easy to say that, well, if this person was so important to you, why weren't they a big part of your life? We all have to choose our own path. And Mike chose his and I chose mine. But that does not underscore the significance that he had in my life and he's had in the lives of many other people. And so I felt it necessary to encapsulate my relationship with him in this message. Because through him, and therefore through me, potentially significance can arise within you, and you within other people. And I do so knowing that someone out there will take this information and make something of it. But there may be no glory or fame or power, but that's not the reason why we do it. We do it because it was what we're meant to do. We do it because this was the gift given to us, because we can. That's the only reason that matters. Everything else is bullshit. So if you're interested in seeing things from a different perspective, I highly insist that you spend a couple bucks and pick up As a Man Thinketh. It's even available in a PDF that you can just read from, and really think about the things and the themes that are in the book and try and apply them to your own life. But understand that anytime that you want to free yourself from the confines of your own prison cell, that the door has been open the entire time. The oppressor just merely lied to you that he locked it. You've never needed a key. You've never needed permission. You've never needed another person. You simply needed to open the door and walk into the unknown outside your own prison. And do so with the confidence that whatever manifests itself is as a result of your own will. And then see what happens. Brings us to the end of today's podcast. If you've made it this far, thank you very much. Your time is valuable, and feel free to leave comments, concerns, questions. Please subscribe if you haven't already, for crying out loud. If you made it this far and you're not a subscriber, what's wrong with you? But above all, thank you for spending the time to listen, lending some real meaning to my life, my friend's life, listening to some of the stories. And through that, we all live on in some form of significance or another. Until then, guys, we will see you out there.